Good morning. Welcome back to Morning Live. Let's take a look at your sports news in this hour. In your tennis news, even the world's best players are not immune to crippling nerves, as Iga Swiatek discovered when her Wimbledon dreams were turned to dust in a quarter-final defeat by Ukrainian wildcard Elina Svitolina. Unseeded Marketa Vondrousova also reached the semi-finals with a roller coaster victory over Jessica Pegula in the last 8. In the men's singles, favourite Novak Djokovic found himself behind for the first time at this year's Wimbledon, but responded in brutal fashion to beat Andrei Rublev and reach the last 4 for the 12th time. Djokovic faces Yannick Sinner next after the Italian also beat a Russian opponent in Roman Saffolina earlier on Tuesday. All right, now, yesterday, a big story breaking through. The European Court of Human Rights ruled in favor of double 800-meter Olympic champion Caster Semenya in a case related to testosterone levels in female athletes. Now, to help understand what this ruling means, we are joined by sports lawyer Shane Wafer from Javelin Sport Consulting. Good morning, Shane, and thank you so much for joining us on Sports on Morning Live.
Morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Shane, let's just talk about this ruling practically. What does it actually mean in terms of Caster's fight that started a couple of years ago, and how does it affect, if at all, those 2018 regulations that were changed in terms of hormone testing and reducing hormone levels for female athletes?
So essentially what this means now is the long-running legal battle has come to an impasse. Caster initially appealed her decision to the Swiss Federal Tribunal from the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and she lost both of those appeals. She then sent her appeal to the European Court of Human Rights that has now ruled in her favor by a slim margin of 4-3 judges. Essentially what this means is Caster has a 3-month waiting period now when anybody can appeal this decision, more specifically the Swiss national government. They must appeal this decision, and they are being pushed to appeal this decision by the World Athletics body. And if that is the case, it'll go to the Grand Chamber, and they will make a final decision on the case and whether or not there will be a final judgment. The ruling does not affect the regulations currently. World Athletics is a monegasque private association. It hasn't been ordered as of yet to change the regulations. They did make a press release indicating that their regulations will not change and that they do not support the decision at this stage. So there is still a bit of a waiting period that Caster has to go through, and there is a very good likelihood that the decision will be appealed, and we then wait for another period for the Grand Chamber to determine whether or not the regulation should be amended. Essentially, what we do have now, though, is that the court has ruled that Caster was discriminated against, and there was a breach of the regulations in terms of this ordeal.
Okay, so Shane, if I'm understanding you properly, what this means is that what was heard before the ECHR doesn't really affect the rules as they currently stand, nor was that case against the rules itself or the DSD, but rather against the Swiss failure to effectively protect Caster's rights at the time.
Correct. The court ruled that there wasn't a correct procedural and institutional review procedure done by the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Essentially, the ruling is not against World Athletics, it's against the Swiss government, and against those two courts. They have ruled that they did not carry out a proper institutional review of the proceedings post the failed appeal. World Athletics is a private association. The rules are not, at this stage, affected. So essentially, the government has lost the case against those two courts having not followed a proper review procedure. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that there must be a proper review of those two failures. What essentially this means is if there is no appeal to that court, Caster has the door open to her to go back to the Court of Arbitration for Sport and refile a case with them to have this matter determined. Only the Court of Arbitration for Sport would be able to rule that the regulations must be overturned.
So do we actually view this as a victory for Caster? Because based on what's happening now, it's also, does it mean that she can go and compete at the next event that's available for her to compete in?
Unfortunately, she cannot compete yet. The regulations still stand as they have stood for the last few years. The recent update earlier this year slightly dropped the levels, but she cannot compete as of yet. It is still a victory, in my opinion, because the court has ruled that she was discriminated against and that there was a breach of the European Court of Human Rights regulations. This must be viewed as a victory. Caster has fought this battle for many, many years, and at all times she has said that these regulations are not fair. They do not make me feel well when I take these testosterone blockers. It is my fault. I am naturally this way. I shouldn't be discriminated against. I do have a DSD, development sexual disorder. I'm not essentially a female or a male. And I do think that this will set the precedent going forward for other athletes like Caster that have this DSD development. And it opens the door and paves the way for there to be a greater discussion on the topic and whether or not we do need to create separate categories, or what do we need to do in this sport and in other sports to allow these athletes to compete without them being discriminated against.
Now, Shane, you mentioned that the decision at the European Court for Human Rights was split 4-3. Did the three that were against give any reasons for why they were against and not in favor of the ruling overall?
So unfortunately, the decision was only published in French. And all three of the dissenting judges also published their decision in French. We await an English translation of the legal review of the case, but at this stage, the court will not publish an English decision for either the 4 judges that made the decision or the 3 dissenting judges. We'll have to wait for that decision to be translated. Hopefully someone takes that step relatively soon. As soon as the English legal summary is published, we may get an opportunity to review what those 3 dissenting judges said, but it was a deeply divided panel. One of the judges that was part of the 4 also provided a part dissenting opinion in his concurring with the main decision. So it is a deeply divided body. They did, however, say that the CAS also ruled that there are major issues with the regulations and they must review those regulations so that there isn't a discrimination against these athletes, and that the science must back up what they are telling athletes to do to their bodies.
Shane, thank you so much for your time this morning. We will call in you again as the story continues to unfold.
Thank you for having me.
That was, of course, Shane Wafer joining us. He is a sport lawyer out at Javelin Sport Consulting, talking all things about the European Court of Human Rights ruling that was made in favor of Caster Semenya.